Did Judaism introduce certain beliefs into the Eastern religions? And what can we learn from the coronavirus? This is Rabbi Yossi Madvig, and you're listening to Jews Did It First. All right, thanks so much for tuning in. I would like to mention that I'd love to blame the fact that I haven't been doing podcasts so regularly on the fact of coronavirus and everything like that, although as you may have noticed I haven't been putting them out on a regular basis for a while now. And the reason for that is primarily because I actually have something that's very important, and I have a Jewish center that I run here for a bunch of college students, and that takes up an enormous amount of my time, in addition to the fact that I have a wife and 7 children that have to be looked after and so on. So if you can go to jewishoswego.org/donate, you will be able to make a huge impact on that front. And it would also allow me to be able to devote more time to what I do here in the podcasts. And I am also currently, because of coronavirus, trying to put down the concepts in my podcast into a book, obviously called Jews Did It First. It actually started out as a book that I wanted to do, but then I realized that writing a book takes too much energy and time and focus. And so I started doing it as a podcast, which was a lot easier to get off the ground. But given the whole coronavirus fiasco, I have realized I've got a little more time to devote to it, and so I'm trying to get it out as a book. Perhaps I won't put everything in the book. Perhaps it'll be volumes, so that way I can at least get a volume out and then follow it up with a second volume. I'm not sure yet, but I actually wanted to revisit a concept that I did earlier, probably a couple of years ago now, and that is Eastern religions. You'll remember from my podcast on Eastern religions, I discussed Hinduism and the Chinese and meditation and incarnation and all these things that really started from Judaism. And it was all based on a verse in Genesis, which I'll just remind you of it now so you don't have to go back to the podcast. It's in Genesis 26, I believe, where Abraham is said to have had other children with a woman, Keturah. And it is, according to Jewish tradition, Keturah was actually Hagar, his previous wife, who had Ishmael, and they end up getting remarried. But the verse says that he sent him to the east with gifts. And so, obviously, the east, we can say east of Israel, so that's going towards India, towards China. And the gifts, the Talmud explains, is names of impurity, God's impure names, or something along those lines. So, what exactly is that? These divine names associated with impurity. It doesn't mean that the names are impure. What it does mean is that you don't have to be pure, you don't have to be in a state of ritual purity called tahara in order to use them. And so these include, manipulation of energy, natural energy, supernatural healing, stuff like that. So, with that in mind, I'm not going to rehash the things that I mentioned last time, but I want to talk about some new things because in researching the book that I'm putting this into, I came across some more very intriguing facts. And part of why I didn't mention them in the first one was because I hadn't researched them fully, or I wasn't able to really find any sources for them. And now I've been sort of finding more sources, and it's been quite interesting. And so I want to focus primarily on Hinduism and the Chinese culture, the ancient Chinese culture, mostly because, sort of Buddhist culture and Jainism and things like that came much later. And so trying to go back as close as possible to Abraham himself. And so when you look at the ancient Indians, the Vedic period, so the classical Vedic period, classical Hinduism, is actually fairly recent, but the Vedic period is around 1500 BCE, which is just a few hundred years after Abraham lived. And where did that come from? Where did that society come from, that Vedic period of Indian society? And most historians believe that nomads came from the northeast, which is where, if you were coming from Abraham, who was in Rakastim, and he was in Israel, so he in that Mesopotamian area, they'd be coming north from the um, northwest. My mistake. And they were known as the Indo-Aryans, and they called themselves Aryans or Arya, which literally means hospitable. And this is incredibly interesting because Jewish tradition is chock full of examples where Abraham is the embodiment of kindness and hospitality. Just to give an example, he would have a tent that had 4 doors, the concept being that you were welcome from any direction. Everyone was welcome. Not like a regular tent has 1 door, very heavily guarded. It's who comes in, who comes out. But he had all 4 sides of his tent were open to passersby. And he would give them, he was in a desert culture there, and those who would pass by, he would offer them food and drink. And then when he would give them the food and drink, they would obviously say, "Thank you so much. How much do I owe you?" And he said, "Tell you what, you just thank God above, not me. It's not me. I didn't give this food. It's not my food. Everything I have comes from God. So please thank God above, and it's free." And this is what would happen. And so what he was doing here was having God's name be called out and teaching people about the divine reality as he knew it. And it was just this incredible hospitable act. And there's other examples throughout Midrash and Talmud of Abraham's kindness and his hospitality. So it's very interesting that the people who influenced Vedic culture were known as the hospitable ones, lending credence to this concept that they were descendants of Abraham and learned from Abraham. Another interesting fact that I found was that the area they settled is known as Kuru. It's a northern region in India during the Iron Age. And this has somewhat, I feel, a possible connection to Abraham. Remember, I mentioned that his wife's name was Keturah, and they settled the area and called it Kuru. So I thought that was quite interesting. Again, none of this is, hard stone. Just you see the connections, and perhaps each one of them by themselves is not so significant, but when you start putting them all together, it creates a very intriguing picture. Another interesting similarity is how Abraham is described in the Bible, and especially as he's described in the Talmud and in Midrash, and how that compares to the Indian Upanishads, which are sacred texts. And one of those is Abraham's search for God. So the Midrash tells us that as a small child, Abraham looked up at the sun and wondered if that was the force which brought the world into existence. But then, of course, the sun sets and the moon rises. So Abraham asks, maybe the moon and the stars or the heavenly forces that are guiding the world. But of course, night ends and the sun comes back. So he realizes it's not the moon, it's not the stars, and he goes through other forces of creation, and he recognizes there has to be this greater underlying force which creates and guides the beauty and harmony of creation. Perfect design, so to speak, implies a perfect designer. So the design theory of God's existence. And he determines that only an infinite God could have created a universe of such infinite beauty and precision. Well, there's a very similar story in the Upanishad, and that is, let's see, the source here. Let me find that. That is in, I'm totally going to screw up these names. I apologize. In the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, that's in 4, paragraph 3, 1 through 6. And I'm using the English translation here of Hume. Hume has a translation of this, and it's on page 133 if you're curious. But anyway, He translates like this. So this is the story. Once, I'm also going to screw up the names that are in here. I apologize. I don't speak Sanskrit or Hindi or anything like this, so I apologize up front. It says, once when Janaka, king of Vidaha, and Yajnavalkya were discussing together at an Agnihorta. I don't know what that is, but they were discussing together. And he chose, it says he granted the former, so this Yajnavalkya granted Janaka a boon. He said, you can have whatever you want. What do you want? And he chose asking whatever question that he wished, and that was granted to him. So the king asked, what light does a person here have? And the answer was, he has the light of the sun, O king. For with the sun indeed, as his light, with the sun indeed as his light, one sits, moves around, does his work, and returns. So he responds, quite so. But when the sun has set, what light does a person here have? The moon indeed is his light, he said. Quite so. But when the sun has set and the moon has set, what light does a person here have? Fire indeed is his light, he answered. Quite so. But when the sun has set and the moon is set and the fire has gone out, what light does a person here have? Speech indeed is his light, he answered. Therefore, O king, where one does not discern even his own hands, when a voice is raised and then one goes straight towards it. I'm not quite sure what that means, but this is kind of the language here is very confusing. But he says, quite so. But when the sun is set and the moon has set and the fire's gone out and speech is hushed, what light does a person here have? And then he answers, the soul, Atman, indeed is his light, he said. For with the soul, indeed, as his light, one sits, moves around, does his work, and returns. So you see this progression of trying to get to the essence of being. Obviously, it's done in a different way. It's sort of, peppered with the theology of Hinduism, but you see the very similar concept that's being worked out here. So, another interesting thing that has been passed along, even though monotheism didn't quite make the cut, obviously the Hindu religion is very pantheistic or polytheistic, whatever you want to say. There's also a very strong strain of what's called monism, which isn't exactly monotheism, but monism is more this idea that there is this underlying creative force, that there's this overarching higher power, that everything exists therein. And so that was quite an interesting concept. Another sort of wordplay that I found quite interesting was that the concept of the soul or the essence of a person is called the Atma or Atman. And in Judaism, the Hebrew term for the essence of a person or the essence of God is called the Etzem. So Atma and Etzem aren't exactly the same, but there's quite a similarity in the word there that it's interesting. Again, it's not that all of these things individually are proof, but when you put them all together, it's quite fascinating. One more thing that actually discusses some texts is the concept of creation. Now, there are different Hindu creation stories, but they each sort of share some connection to the biblical account that would have been taught by Abraham's descendants. One is the concept of creation ex nihilo. And now, despite the fact that Hinduism believes that creation is an eternal process of creation and destruction, you still find this concept of ex nihilo, something out of nothing, of absolute void and nothingness. So, for instance, in one of these stories, the god Vishnu is sitting coiled in, he's sitting or sleeping on a coiled serpent that's hovering over the vast ocean, which is obviously very reminiscent of the first chapter in Genesis, where God's spirit is hovering over the water, over the vast ocean. And Rashi, who's one of the preeminent biblical commentators, explains that this is God's throne of glory. So it's his throne, he's sitting on a throne and on the ocean, much like Vishnu sitting on this snake. And perhaps the snake is this reference to the snake in the Garden of Eden. Another intriguing thing is that there was a sound that spurred creation and pushed away the nothingness. Now, this is the famous, Om of Hindu tradition. Likewise, in the Bible, it is sound. It is the word of God speaking the universe into existence. Another Hindu tradition has the universe and all living beings being created out of the body of Purusha, who is this primordial cosmic being. Obviously, Judaism doesn't believe in the creation of the universe in that way, but it does recall the creation of Chava, Eve, the woman, coming from the side of Adam, of the man, right? That her creation is literally from his body. Now, Shiva, the god of death and destruction, demons, traditionally has a serpent around his neck. This could also be sort of this veiled reference to the snake in the Garden of Eden. And there's two more points I want to point out as far as the link between the Hindu creation tradition and the biblical one. So, like I said, there's not just one creation, but there's this cycle of creation and destruction. Now, this doesn't sit well with the biblical narrative. However, it is very much in line with the Kabbalistic explanation of creation. So, according to Kabbalah, the creation of the universe involves the creation and destruction of several worlds before we get to the world in which we inhabit. Now, although there are different opinions as to whether it means spiritual worlds or actual physical creations, it's still a very amazing parallel. And also, much like I mentioned in the first thing about you have the caste in the Hindu system, where the Brahmins are the highest caste, which kind of sounds like Abrahamin. Well, the creator God is called Brahma. Now, if you just take the A at the end of Brahma and put it in the beginning, you have Abram, which was the name of Abraham before he had his name changed. Which is quite amazing. And if you move on to the Buddhist tradition, I was focusing more on the Hindu tradition, but if you move on to the Buddhist tradition, which is very similar in many ways to the Hindu tradition, there is a text in which the Buddha describes creation like this. Okay, this is in the where is this? Hold on, let me just grab the footnote here. The Agana Sutta, a gift of Dhamma. Okay, so I found this translation online, and he describes creation like this. There comes a time when sooner or later, after a long period, this world contracts. At a time of contraction, beings are mostly born in the Abhasara Brahma world. And there they dwell, mind-made, feeding on delight, self-luminous, moving through the air, glorious, and they stay like that for a very long time. But sooner or later, after a very long period, this world begins to expand again. At a time of expansion, the beings from the Abhasara Brahma world, having passed away from there, are mostly reborn in this world. Here they dwell, mind-made, feeding on delight, self-luminous, moving through the air, glorious, and they stay like that for a very long time. Now, I would like to compare this to a book of Kabbalah, which is called Sefer Yetzirah. Literally means the book of formation or the book of creation. And this, according to Jewish tradition, was actually written by Abraham himself. So listen to this explanation. These 10 numbers, beyond Ein Sof, meaning beyond the infinity of God, have boundless realms, boundless origin and end, an abyss of good and one of evil, boundless height and depth, east and west, north and south, and the one only God and King, faithful forever, seated on his throne, shall rule over all forever and ever. These 10 Sephirot, which are these 10 attributes by which God creates, which are ineffable, whose appearance is like scintillating flames, have no end, but are infinite. The word of God is in them, and they burst forth. And as they return, they obey the divine command, rushing along as a whirlwind, returning to prostrate themselves at his throne. So you see some common themes here of timelessness, light, expansion. Now, regarding the light, the Abhasara beings emanate flashing light, just as these Sephirot that are mentioned in Sefer Yetzirah have scintillating flames, flashing light. Then, as the creation story continues, you actually see some similarities more to the biblical narrative. He says, at that period there was just one mass of water, and all was darkness, blinding darkness. Neither moon nor sun appeared, no constellations or stars appeared, night and day were not yet distinguished, nor months and fortnights, nor years and seasons. There was no male and female, beings being reckoned just as beings, and sooner or later, after a very long period of time, savory earth spread itself over the waters where these beings were. It looked just like the skin that forms itself over hot milk as it cools. It was endowed with color, smell, and taste. It was the color of fine ghee or butter, and it was very sweet, like pure wild honey. And then it continues. Then some being of a greedy nature said, I say, what can this be? And tasted the savory earth on his finger. In doing so, it became taken with the flavor, and craving arose in it. Then other beings, taking their cue from that one, also tasted the stuff with their fingers. They too were taken with the flavor, and craving arose in them. So they set to with their hands, breaking off pieces of the stuff in order to eat it. And the result was that their self-luminance disappeared. And as a result of the disappearance of their self-luminance, the moon and the sun appeared. Night and day were distinguished, months and fortnights appeared, and the year and its seasons. Now, if you compare this to the Genesis story, where it says, the earth was unformed and void, there was darkness on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God divided the light from darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place. And the dry land appeared. And God called the dry land earth, and he gathered together the waters and called it seas. And the earth brought forth grass, herb yielding seed after its kind, and trees bearing fruit, wherein is the seed thereof after its kind. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament, and the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God let the firmament of the heaven set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and rule over the day and over the night, and divide the light from darkness. So there's plenty of differences within these two accounts, but the similarities are quite uncanny. It seems to also to sort of recall the story, if you know the story of the B'nai Elohim, these angels of God that were enticed by women and lowered their spiritual existence to that of coarse physical beings. So this, when you have these people, these beings that are sort of enticed from being this high spiritual form of existence and being enticed to come down into the nether realms of existence. And also, another striking similarity is that you have this concept of what is it that causes them to fall from this heightened being of this higher being of existence, this higher plane of existence. It's this food, right? The earth is considered food, and they start tasting it and so on. Well, clearly this seems to recall, at least in my mind, the biblical narrative of Adam and Eve eating from the fruit of the tree, and they're being enticed by it, and thereby losing their higher status of existence. Now, I had some doubts as to whether or not to put this final thing that I want to talk about into a separate category, make it a separate podcast. But I think since we're already on the topic of Eastern religion, I'm just going to start with I'll just mention some interesting tidbits in the Eastern flood stories that really make us look twice. Because everybody knows that there's flood stories around the world, which is quite interesting. If there's flood stories, worldwide flood stories, in pretty much every culture around the world, it does tend to lend some credence to the fact that maybe something like this did occur. So here we go. You probably know that in the biblical narrative, the main character is Noah, or Noach in Hebrew, but Noah. And he was the only righteous person in his generation, and God commands him to build an ark and save his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. Now, if you look at the ancient Chinese flood myth, and they have a few, but one of them has a main character whose name is Noah. And if that doesn't ring any bells and set off red flags, I don't know what does. So you have Noah in the Bible, and then in China you have Nuwa. What's also intriguing is the name of the emperor during that flood is named Yao, which perhaps could be linked to the name of God, right? The name of God that we don't say, but it's right, the YAWEH, and is how it's normally spelled. We don't usually say it, but clearly this Yao emperor seems to have a very similar name there, who was the god of Abraham, obviously. Also, the waters that come up from the river to flood the land were said to be boiling, which is consistent with the biblical narrative as is explained in the Talmud, which you can find in Sanhedrin, page 108, if you want to go look it up. This concept of boiling water, sulfuric water that's coming up from the depths. So the Chinese flood myths, very, very similar to the biblical narrative. And the Hindu religion, also there's a few versions of the story, but in at least 2 of them, Manu, who is the one who's saved, he brings 7 sages on board. Now, first of all, his name is Manu. You still have this Nuwa, the name, which is similar to Noah. This is Manu instead of Nuwa, but this Manu, he's saved. He brings 7 sages on board. Now, 7 sages plus Manu is very similar to the idea that when Noah brought on board the ark, he brought 8. There were 8 people, right? There's Noah and his wife, that's 2. He had 3 sons, that's 5. And then his 3 sons had wives, each had a wife, which brings to 8. So it's entirely plausible that Abraham's descendants handed down knowledge of the flood story, and that was incorporated sort of into their religious beliefs. So I don't want to get too much into the Epic of Gilgamesh, but I will say, because it would be remiss if I mention the flood story and I don't mention the Epic of Gilgamesh, because everyone seems to know it's probably the most known version of a flood narrative aside from the biblical narrative. And in fact, many scholars say it's this pre-biblical thing, and so therefore the Bible got its idea for the story from the Epic of Gilgamesh. I find that hard to believe. on two accounts. One reason, actually, I find it hard to believe, is because every culture in the world seems to have a flood story. So I don't think the fact that there's this Akkadian version, this Semitic, Mesopotamian version of the story, therefore leads to the Bible having one, because if everyone has one, then everyone has one, and I don't think it's that big of a deal. The second reason has to do with some tricky dating. So I'll say so here's my hypothesis, if you will. So the Epic of Gilgamesh claims to have taken place somewhere around the year 2700 BCE. Okay, that's about 800 to 900 years before Abraham lived. That's when it claims to take place. Certainly something to consider. However, the earliest version of the entire written story itself is dated somewhere between the 13th and the 10th century BCE, which is at least 100 years and maybe 300 years after the Torah itself was written. Forget when Abraham lived. The Torah itself was written hundreds of years after Abraham. I believe it was 500 years, if I'm not mistaken, after Abraham. So, but we're talking 100 to 300 years after that even. And the Torah mentions the flood in its opening chapters. Now, the Sumerian version of the flood story also dates to around 100 years after Abraham himself. And at best, it seems that these two versions of the flood narrative were maybe contemporary. One version being passed down orally by Noah and his sons and followers and Abraham and the slave population of Jews in Egypt, and the other being passed down among the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. So I think that, like I said, at best, maybe you could say they were contemporary, but I think there is a good amount of evidence to show that even the biblical, that even with all that, the biblical narrative of the flood seems to have predated that, and therefore, I will say, Jews did it first. I want to end off by just sharing some brief thoughts on the coronavirus situation. I know that a lot's been said about it over the past few months, and I've already gone over a half an hour here, so I don't want to take up too much time. But I just want to mention that I think one silver lining, if you will, of this whole lockdown is that it's really brought to the fore our desire for relationships and interpersonal connections. We've increasingly become a more isolated society with the advent of various technologies and certainly the rise in social media, which perhaps should be more aptly called anti-social media. People who are sitting behind a keyboard are much more likely to have very abrasive interactions with other people. You might say things to another person that you would never do and you would never say in person because you have some what we call derech eretz. You have some manners. And I think what's happened now is we've come to a point where we've realized that this sort of interaction, of online interaction, is just not enough. It really has brought out a desire to be out in public with other people, sharing experiences, being at the park, being at the beach, whatever it is, where we just want to get out, go for a walk, enjoy the fresh air, enjoy the outdoors, be with other people. And another thing that I found interesting is both on my wife's side and myself is that it's really caused us to rethink the relationships that we do have. I assume I'm not the only one, and my wife and I aren't the only ones that have sort of rekindled or reinvigorated our relationships with our other family members. I know my wife has been having weekly conference calls on Zoom with her sisters and her mother. I've been doing weekly Zoom chats and meetings before Shabbos with various alumni and friends and my mother. And these are conversations that would not have happened otherwise. And boy, I really wish I would have bought stock in Zoom a few months ago, let me tell you. But it's really allowed us to see what we were doing. And you even see this in the media. You had, I think it was it Chris Cuomo, I think, was basically saying how he was really rethinking his whole life in journalism, being that, when he had coronavirus, and rethinking his priorities. And it's the same with all of us. We've really been able to put things into perspective. And I'm hoping that as these lockdown measures start relaxing a little bit, as they've started doing, that we're able to carry that into our normal life. We're able to carry on these relationships, these renewed relationships, and develop even brand new ones. And we should all be able to come together as a people, as a society, and realize that while we may not all be in the same boat, as the saying goes, we are all at least in the same storm. And perhaps if you see another person whose boat in this storm is not as sturdy as yours, help them out, reach out to them, create that interpersonal relationship. And that will certainly go a long way in bridging that gap between being personal, private individuals and being a society and a community. So I wish you all a wonderful week, a Shabbat Shalom, and we're coming up on the holiday of Shavuos, which is the giving of the Torah. It celebrates the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, and we should all receive the Torah with joy and with happiness and with a renewed sense of self and our connection to each other and our connection to God. Shabbat Shalom.